Actual Karen? Okay. Boomer. To protest or not to protest. The revolt of the least of these. There's only one thing the least of these have to fall back on, and that's each other. Just like the civil rights movement or the women's movement, we do not have weapons because the government and police have bigger weapons, and they have our tax money, which they want for the Trump GOP cult's anti-immigrant wall. All of the protests in Portland, and I assume elsewhere, begin with BLM. George Floyd, speeches, singing, dancing, chanting, and defunding and removing and reforming the police. But Donald Trump's private Gestapo turns it into something else. The movement we need to be looking at, the one the GOP hates the most, is the labor movement. They can argue about who was responsible for abolishing slavery or who was more responsible for Jim Crow, but the effort to keep the least of these under the control and thumb of the government and industry can be laid almost totally at the foot of the GOP. Due to Trump and the GOP ignoring the pandemic, a strike isn't needed, but masks and social distancing are, and work safety is back on the top of the grievance list. The least of these have our bodies and a vote, which they're trying to suppress at warp speed. The internet is a huge advantage because in the past, getting the word out through corporate-owned newspapers, TV, and radio was difficult. The GOP has always been against anything that helps people in need. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, fair housing. There's no talk from Donald Trump, his Senate, or his GOP cult about a living wage, job security, job safety, affordable health care, affordable housing. The term community organizing is called socialistic, just like the labor movement was called by the same GOP. Anything to help the least of these is off the table. In fact, the defund the police movement is this movement and does not eliminate the police, just reform it and take some of the money used for military equipment. The least of these are asking for a tiny amount, but are blamed for everything. You can have a police union, but not a teachers union. Teaching, according to the GOP, is a calling, like a preacher, that depends on the kindness of others to buy candy or magazines and does not, according to the GOP, require a living wage. Of course, nearly every country in the world not controlled by a dictator or Donald Trump's cult has some form of democratic socialism and health care for all. Health care should be a right and not a privilege for those who can afford it. By the way, the GOP's new stimulus plan does not only have a liability shield for bosses, but prevents anyone filing suit against anyone like those who messed up this entire pandemic response for years. Of course, they've already made it impossible to have a class action suit, even though the king of lawsuits is in the White House. This time they're having a harder time pitting us against each other by race. One big difference is that with the labor movement, Christianity was on the side of the least of these. However, white evangelicals were not on the side of the civil rights movement or the women's movement, and they're not on the side of this one. They want everyone to go back to work with no mandatory safety requirements. They want seniors to sacrifice their lives for unregulated capitalism, and they now want to use our grandchildren and seem to believe it'll be just like the sniffles with them, and no child will end up in the hospital, although some have already died. Because they hate science, they do not understand that viruses evolve. There were more events in the past, like this one, that we're having now, but here are 11 that people usually point out. You need to look these up for more information. In 1874, there was the Tompkins Square riot in New York City. In 1877, it was the Molly Maguires. They were a secret Irish organization. The Chicago Tribune called them a secret, oath-bound organization controlled by murderers and assassins. Kind of like Antifa with more organization, except Antifa doesn't kill anyone. In 1886, there was the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago over an 8-hour work week. In 1910, it was the garment workers' strike and the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire about work safety. 146 workers, mostly women in their teens and 20s, died because they were locked in to get more productivity from the workers. In 1914, it was the Ludlow Massacre in Colorado. All of these have one thing in common. The least of these had to depend on the bosses for everything. In some cases, like in Colorado, they had company stores and medical care, such as it was, and they had company housing. The strikers were thrown out of housing and living in tents, and the military was brought in with machine guns. 2 women and 11 children were killed in a fire underground because they were trying to get away from the machine guns. In 1916, the Everett, Washington Massacre. This was about the Wobblies, another effort at the least of these banding together. In 1919, it was the Seattle General Strike, which was called the first Red Scare, kind of like the McCarthy thing in the 50s, except with more people dying. In 1920, it was the Battle of Mattawan, West Virginia. Most of these involved bosses or the government sending in people to infiltrate, to cause problems, to blame on the protesters. 1968, there was the Poor People's Campaign that MLK started. In 1981, the air traffic controller strike. Because they were government workers, like teachers, and not supposed to strike, the GOP and Reagan fired all of them and hired all new people. Do not assume they prefer to keep trained people over training a whole new group of complacent workers. The last one they mentioned was in 2011 was the Wisconsin protests, which was labor, mostly teachers and government workers, against Scott Walker and the Tea Party group. Look these all up so that you can find out more information about it. Black Lives Matter, and thank you. Bye.